Good morning. Thank you for joining us for another informative virtual genealogy program with Terri Meeks. My name is Lisa Stutz, the director of the Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center. Before I turn it over to Terri this morning, I have a few housekeeping tips and a couple of announcements I'd like to share. We ask that if you have any questions during the program, to please type your questions into the chat box. We will be monitoring the chat box throughout the program, and we will make sure to answer any of your questions at the end of the program. You can test this feature now by typing hello. As for upcoming events, the museum will be hosting a historic walking tour of downtown Canyon City on Thursday, August 21st at 5:30. You can register for the tour through the museum's website at canyoncity.gov/museum. On Saturday, August 23rd, in conjunction with our exhibit on Italian heritage, the Sons of and Daughters of Italy will be hosting a bocce demonstration on the museum's lawn from 11 to 2 p.m. that afternoon. The event will be free, but visitors will be encouraged to see the exhibit in order to sample the Italian sausage sandwiches that they will be having. To learn about more upcoming museum programs and other events provided by the Canyon City Public Library, please stop by our shared booth at the Farmers Market on Saturday mornings from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. in front of the Royal Gorge Chamber Alliance Depot office. And finally, our next virtual genealogy class will be held on Saturday, September 6th at 9 a.m. Registration for the class will be available online in the coming weeks. Thank you again for joining us, and I will now turn it over to Terri.
Good morning. Today we're going to talk about the founding of the National Weather Service. We are all aware of our daily weather, and we all recognize that given the chance, it will change. So let's just jump right into it. From the beginning of time, virtually, weather was observed. People planning to plant crops, people planning to move from one area to another, they recognized that weather was influential. They relied, weather observation was just what the person saw. It wasn't until the 1600s that instrumentation actually started to come on board, and that more or finer observations were able to be made. And it was quite late that the Fahrenheit and Celsius scales for temperature were devised. So for centuries, weather and the reporting of weather was relied on observation. And to that point, there was no forecasting or prediction for areas of what the weather would be. So one of the first people that made observations here in the colonies was John Campius Holm. For most of the records, his name is just listed as John Campius. He was a Swedish Lutheran priest, and he was sent to New Sweden in the American colonies. New Sweden is approximately where Wilmington, Delaware is located today. And he recorded the observations of weather, and he is the earliest to have known to have done this in a systematic fashion. He is considered the first weatherman in America. So he kept a daily record in New Sweden for the 2 years 1644 to 1645. And that is one of the earliest records that we have. He returned to Sweden in 1648 and continued to make observations, but also to continue his life as a Lutheran priest. Each year, the award by the Weather Service is given in his name, and there is an award that recognizes accomplishments in meteorological observations. So interesting there. And here is a map of New Sweden where we see the Delaware River. And this is the area and the time frame where he would have served. So we mentioned that there was not a lot of instrumentation to measure the various aspects of weather. However, starting in about the 15th century, 1450, the anemometer was invented by Leon Alberti. The anemometer measures wind speed. That was followed by the thermometer and the barometer by our two Italian gentlemen in the middle of the 1600s. But it wasn't until as late as the 18th century that our Fahrenheit and Celsius scales were discovered. Here are two pictures of anemometers. The one on the left is similar to the one that Alberti would have invented, and it used the wind pressure to push that slanted bar to measure the wind, whereas the one on the right is more current. It's not exactly like today's, but it is very, very similar to today's anemometers. Our friend Benjamin Franklin, among all of his other hobbies, he too was an amateur meteorologist. In 1743, he actually documented the movement of a hurricane from Philadelphia to Boston. He recognized that the storm moved from the west to the east. And from the observations that he made, he was able to predict the path of the storm. And he recognized that these paths could be plotted for future reference. In 1752, he performed his kite experiment, and he proved that lightning was an electrical phenomenon. Starting very early on in the 1730s, he published Poor Richard's Almanac, and it contained some of the first recorded weather forecasts, so based on some of his observations. He also suggested that volcanic eruptions could affect weather. And we see the truth of that many years later in 1816, when the volcano at Mount Tambora in Indonesia erupted in 1816, and it caused a year without sunshine. People experienced snow in the middle of summer. Crops failed. There was widespread hunger because of all of the crop failures. And there were days where the sun never came out because it was covered with volcanic ash. So an important criterion that he had discovered. Here's a copy of one of the early Poor Richard almanacs. And we see his 1752 experiment with the kite. John Jeffries, an interesting man. He was a Boston physician, and during the Revolutionary War, he took daily observations of the weather in the Boston area. What's interesting about him is he was a British loyalist. He did take measurements of temperature, barometric pressure, and wind direction. And these are some of the earliest weather observations where we have the actual printed page. He actually was expelled from Boston and returned to England. He looks kind of weird. And he did continue making weather observations. In 1784, he, along with a couple of other gentlemen, did a series of balloon observations. They carried a thermometer, barometer, and a hydrometer up to 9,000 feet. And he actually then went over to France and coordinated with Mr. Blanchard to conduct the first balloon flight over the English Channel. And here they took measurements of the temperatures, the air pressure at various altitudes. And this was some of the first data that allowed insight into the vertical structure of the atmosphere. He did actually return to the United States after the Civil War and continued work as a physician in Boston. Thomas Jefferson, he was also a weather aficionado. He bought his first thermometer when writing the Declaration of Independence, exactly on July 4th, 1776. And we will see that. He purchased his first barometer a few days after the signing of the Declaration. And for 50 years, he maintained an unbroken record of weather observations. He took observations several times a day, recorded the information, temperature, barometer, and whether the moisture content, rain, snow, etc. So he proposed a plan to provide a thermometer to every county in Virginia. Oops. So here we see on July 4th of 1776 in one of his account books that he'd paid Sparhawk for a thermometer, and he paid £3.15, which probably was an expensive investment. Here are some of his daily observations of the weather. We see the time and we see temperature. And some of his observations were collected and then monthly recorded. The times 8 in the morning and 2 p.m. in the afternoon. And we have the average for the thermometer, the low, the high, and averages. And we have the comments out at the right where he had 7 days of rain in the given month of January, 5 days with snow. So an avid weatherman, 50 years. Not only did he want to provide thermometers for all of Virginia, he actually recruited volunteer weather observers. And this is a phenomenon that spread very, very widely. By 1800, there were volunteers in 5 other states to make these same types of observations. People were beginning to recognize the importance of recording the information and disseminating it to their local communities. Washington also was a regular weather observer for quite some time. He kept 2 different kinds of diaries. He did keep a weather diary as well as a personal diary. And in it, he recorded the various weather conditions in his weather diary. Dark and at the same time, a bright and reddish kind of light intermixed with them. So his last entry in his general diary was made on the day before he died. Morning, snowing, and about 3 inches deep. So by the mid 1800s, there were whole networks of observers of the weather. They grew and they expanded across the United States. So in 1818, the Surgeon General of the Army stepped in. He recognized that disease and climate had something to do with one another. Malaria might have cropped up under certain weather conditions. We see things, we see certain diseases even now. The temperature of warm water promotes the growth of bacteria, so people are getting bacterial infections. And he recognized this early on, but was not able to have precise understanding. So he directed that they record weather events as well as everything related to the medical field to see if they could surmise some conclusions. And this actually helped to determine the cause and effect between climate and health. The biggie came along in 1845 when the telegraph was invented. This allowed people to share their observations. The telegraph network would allow people in New York to communicate with those people in Boston or other areas. So the possibility for forecasting storms was introduced at this same time. Somebody in Ohio could see and record weather information, and they could notify the people in neighboring New York via telegraph that a storm was coming. They also recruited volunteers. Here again, those volunteer observers across the country were providing this valuable information. The Smithsonian Institution was also a huge recorder of weather information, and they actually supplied weather instruments to the telegraph companies so that their telegraph workers could make observations and pass those along. Here is one of the earliest telegraphs. And we see the network of weather stations that did exist as of December 1849. The ones that are filled in with solid colors are those where the volunteers were working, as opposed to those that are the hollow where the U.S. Army. And we see where the Army is out on the frontier, kind of in 1849. We do not see too many West Coast observation points or beyond the Texas-Nebraska area. And of course, the volunteers are centered along the East Coast. Joseph Henry was the first director of the Smithsonian Institute. And it's interesting that he too was particularly interested in weather and weather phenomenon. As we've just seen in that December 1849 map, he had established a network of 150 volunteers, and they were reporting their observations directly to the Smithsonian. The museum or institution provided instruments for the measurement of the weather, and they had standardized forms so that people could record the same information for their particular area. They could record the temperature, the barometric pressure, wind speeds, etc. And each volunteer was supplied with a set of instructions on how to record the information, when to take the observations, etc. They did provide monthly reports, and Henry arranged for 20 telegraph stations to report once a day what the weather conditions were. And we see one of the meteorological tables, and they go by month for the years 1863 through 66. And these are compiled at Geneva. And we see the barometrical height is given as corrected for temperature of 32 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature given was obtained by an average of 3 observations per day, 7 a.m., 2 p.m., and 9 p.m. And these results were averaged for the month. So they had specific instructions on how to provide this information. Henry took this information and he drew a daily weather map. And regrettably, I could not find a copy of one of these because I really wanted to see how he devised this. He had a map of the United States, and it was colored in white for clear skies and the other colors depending on the weather conditions. So by 1860, he had 500 stations reporting weather to the Washington Evening Star, the newspaper in Washington, D.C. However, this work was unfortunately interrupted by the Civil War. But by the end of the war, they recognized how important weather was and how important weather observations were. So Congress authorized the Secretary of War to take observations at military stations. And what they were particularly interested in was because of sinking of ships and its effect on commerce, etc., they wanted marine reports for the Great Lakes, the Atlantic, and the Gulf coasts. These reports would expand, as we will see in a couple of slides, but initially it was weather over water. The information was sent by telegraph and by marine signals, and it allowed them to do some of the elementary forecasting of the approach and the force of storms. The first message was actually sent on November 4th of 1870, and a week later, they had their first storm warning. Actually, the message was actually forecasting a storm. We see here an 1871 Scribner's Monthly Magazine, weather, telegrams, and storm forecasts. Unfortunately, there's a little bit of a disconnect here because we're talking about 1870, 1871, but the picture they're showing is of the rescue that took place in 1853, so almost 20 years earlier. But we get the idea. We can see storms coming, and we can warn ships to stay in port or to effect rescues as needed. Another one in 1871, we see Harper's Magazine showing the telegraph and the storm. So it was on that February that President Ulysses Grant actually signed into law the National Weather Service. He created it as part of the U.S. Army Signal Service because the Army had been involved in making these observations. General Albert Meyer was appointed director of the National Weather Service. And as I just mentioned, rather than just the Great Lakes and the Atlantic coast, we now are doing observations and predictions for weather stages and floods. Here again, shipping and sea travel for commerce are the focuses. And it's the following year that they finally realized that predictions also benefit agriculture and commerce. The farmers needed to know what was coming. So we have the Signal Service in 1870 under President Grant, and we have 24 stations initially, but within 2 years, the number had almost tripled to just 66. And by 1878, 284 stations making observations. They did take the 3 observations in a given day, morning, afternoon, and night, and they measured barometric pressure, temperature, precipitation, humidity, winds, clouds, and the state of the weather, whether it was actually raining, snowing, etc. The weather observations remained in the War Department with the Signal Service until 1890. My mouse does not appear to want to move. So, apologize for that. In 1873, General Meyer proposed a worldwide exchange of weather observations. And this was so popular that it was actually adopted the following year. There was an international exchange of the observations, and it became extensive. This was enabled by the completion in 1866 of the transatlantic telegraph cable. So now we have weather observations on an international scale. Data from Europe, China, Japan, the Far East, Latin and South America, and ships at sea were actually collected. The collection was performed by military, but the forecasting was performed by both civilians and military officers. And here is the first Signal Corps headquarters in Washington, D.C. in 1870. Cleveland Abbey. In 1871, he became the chief meteorologist for the Weather Bureau. He had been doing forecasting duties at the Cincinnati Observatory, and he recognized that how important instrumentation was, and he actually selected the instrumentation that would be used by all of the observers. Since it was part of the Signal Corps, he trained the military observers, and he initially produced weather maps himself and later supervised the creation of weather maps. In 1871, he sent out his first Signal Service forecast. He founded a monthly journal, the Monthly Weather Review, which is still currently being published. It continued as part of the U.S. Weather Bureau until 1970 and is now being published by the American Meteorological Society. He was also instrumental in the adoption of standard time zones in the United States. And it's really interesting to recognize that this wasn't until 1883, and it was at the instigation of the railroads. Railroads were producing timetables. Our train would leave Baltimore at such a time, and it was expected to arrive in New York at a time. And because there was not a standard time zone, they were not able to tell when to expect the train. So that's when the country was divided into the various time zones. And Abbey was one of the main drivers behind that. He served as the chief meteorologist until his death in 1916. So a good 44, 45 years. And here is Clinton Abbey. And here is one of his weather reports. It's really, really hard to read. I don't understand the symbology, but we do see it's kind of a map. We see on the upper right, the highest one is Buffalo. We see New York. We see Cleveland. So they're mapped in relative proportion to where these cities were located within the United States. But a far cry from what we have today. At first, forecasting was made within 24 hours. It included the state of the weather, the wind, pressure, and temperature. And these forecasts were made 3 times a day. And the forecasts, the country was divided into somewhere between 8 and 11 districts. And these districts would forecast for their own district what the weather would be. In 1885, it was changed to 32 hours. They realized that they could have a longer lead time and perhaps change it within those 32 hours to update. In 1888, it went to 36 hours ahead of time. So in 1874, Mr. Henry from the Smithsonian transferred all of his volunteers to the Signal Service. And General Hazen became the chief signal officer. He wanted more basic scientific research, so he expanded the focus and the measurement and the development of further instrumentation to augment weather reports. The Army was no longer happy running essentially what was a civilian service. The civilians were doing most of the actual forecasting, and we had this whole bevy of Smithsonian volunteers. So the Army decided that it was no longer in their purview. So Congress transferred the responsibility to the civilian U.S. Weather Bureau under the Department of Agriculture rather than the Department of War. In that same year, 1890, Congress also established the Cooperative Observer Program. And essentially, here again, they are enlisting volunteers to take daily observations. And by 1895, they had more than 2,000 observer stations. And we see by the end of the 19th century, the number of observer locations. We're covering the whole map now. So how did they make observations. We see that we've seen the people, but we've got the Weather Bureau now, and they need to use some new technology to make their observations. One of the first things they relied on was weather kites. But the limitation was that they could only go up to about 10,000 feet, and they could not collect upper atmospheric conditions. And they could only be used in good weather. So fortunately, with the invention of the aircraft, by 1933, aircraft had replaced kites and balloons also. So we see this is a weather kite, and it's specifically a Drexel kite. And we can see why it had to be done in good conditions. Today, we have 122 weather forecast offices, and they have a continuing program for those observers and the recruitment of those observers, their training, instruments, and their maintenance. And here we see those 122 observation. Until the 1990s, observers recorded each day's observations on a paper form. And when they filled out the form at the end of the month, those were mailed in to their respective weather forecast offices. And this data was then collected and sent to the National Centers for Environmental Information for digitizing. So this is up until the 1990s, daily and monthly reports. So now they are sent daily via the internet. But we see one of these from December of 1982 from Dade County, Florida. And we see the minimum temperature, the maximum temperature, the average. We see the conditions throughout the day, the amount of precipitation, and any notes out in the margin. So these forms were collected daily, submitted monthly. As early as 1892, the French were sending balloons to collect meteorological data. And it wasn't until 1904 that the United States sent their first weather balloon up in St. Louis, Missouri. But by the 1930s, they were using weather balloons on a regular basis. Today, the National Weather Service in Lincoln, Nebraska, launches weather balloons twice a day, 5 a.m. and 5 p.m. on standard time, an hour later on daylight savings time. The balloons are inflated with hydrogen, and they have a train attached to them that has a parachute and an instrument package called a radio sonde. And we see here the balloon, and we see the parachute. And here is the technical radio sonde. It has angled wires that measure temperature. They measure humidity. There's a pressure sensor, and they come with a postage-paid mailing bag. These weather balloons are sent up, they float in the sky, they descend, and it's up to the finder to mail it back to the Weather Service. Today, we also use automated systems on commercial aircraft. There are all kinds of weather models. We have radar, and we now have satellites. So weather forecasting has changed considerably. Here from the Weather Bureau, the Weather Forecast Office. We see the various models that are used to predict weather. We see also the various satellite programs that are used, two primarily. So, in terms of genealogy, where do we find the information? We go to our regular sources on ancestry, newspapers, a lot of information in books, and specifically the National Weather Service website and the NOAA, the National Oceanic Administration. So here we see Chauncey Camp. And don't forget, not everybody is a weather forecaster or a weatherman on TV. This is an 1850 census, and Chauncey is involved in the weather aspect by making barometers. So don't overlook thinking outside of the box as to how someone in your family might have been involved with the Weather Service. Here is an 1865 New York state census, and it's for industry, not agriculture, but industry, and it's not the population census. It is E. Kendall and Company, and they too are making barometers. So did someone in your family work for this company? We have an 1880 census, and we see Alex Brown. He is a weather observer in Leavenworth, Kansas. We have Abel Childs in 1880, and he is a meteorologist in Plattsmouth City, Nebraska. 1900, Stanley Lemons. He's a weather observer in Meridian, Mississippi, which would have been a key location considering the Great Flood in Galveston, Texas in 1900. His weather observations, had they been transferred via telegraph or predicted, might have helped with that flood. In 1930, Lee Bender, he's a junior observer for the U.S. Weather Bureau in Houston, Texas. We see in our city directories, 1893, critical time between that 1880 census and the 1900 census. We see Mr. Melvin working for the Weather Bureau as an observer. Mr. Sharp, a weather observer at the University of New Mexico. Mr. Green, working for a meteorological aide, working for the Weather Bureau. And we see Vernon, a meteorological tech for the Weather Bureau. We also see on those meteorological observations that are recorded, who is the librarian? This is recorded at the Library Association of Portland, Oregon. And we see a Mr. Oxon, who is the librarian, a completely almost detached person, but who is involved in the Weather Service. We see Belfort Meteorological Observatory, Perhaps someone in your family lived in Maryland and might have worked there. And we see from the craftsman files on Ancestry very early on, we're looking at the 1700s here. Here's a reference to an advertisement in the New York Daily Advertiser for a thermometer and a barometer maker. So way before census recordings. We have Mr. Fisher, also a barometer maker. In the mid 1800s, we have the Gender Company that are making thermometers, hydrometers, watches, and jewelry. Interestingly enough, in military records, we find that R. Frank Young was working in the Weather Bureau office in Los Angeles. And was collecting a Civil War pension. There's also a U.S. Register of Civil, Military, and Naval Service. And because the Weather Bureau fell under that aegis, we see a whole listing of people that were meteorologists. And these people are serving overseas in the Philippine Islands or in Thule, Greenland. And we see them in Seattle, Montana, Idaho, Alaska, performing various functions. We're talking about a lot of information trying to find your specific relative, but it's also important for you when studying your family to know what the weather was like in a particular area at a specific time. Here is a recording of statistical returns from a Michigan census, a state census in 1894. And it's a write-up, and it talks about the year 1889 was not a good corn year. The first 10 days, the weather was extremely warm and dry. So did somebody in your family live in Michigan, and did they lose their whole crop during this particular point in time? Weather definitely affected your family at various times. This is the same thing. Knowing what the weather was in your particular area to understand why your relative might have sold his land, might have moved on to another farm area. For World War I, we see that Alan Waterman was in the Signal Corps for the U.S. Weather Bureau in Cincinnati, Ohio. California voter registrations. Mr. Smith is a weather observer. Even in death records, we see that Mr. Henry Bates passed away and worked for the Weather Bureau. Even on extracted marriage weathers information. We saw Mr. Bender in the census, and we see him here in a marriage index where he's working for the Airport Weather Bureau. This is another case of what the weather was like. Was perhaps someone in your family in the merchant marine or aboard a ship. And we see the conditions, experienced a constant succession of gales and heavy weather from the northeast, east, and southeast, and lost 2 jibs, 2 mainsails. This was quite a storm. This was one of the most interesting things. I don't know who would have thought to make a barometer using leeches, but It gives you the recipe for how to make the barometer, and it goes on to say the various weather conditions and how the leech would react to them. At the bottom, it says the top should be covered over with a piece of muslin. I totally agree. We see whether they're looking for personnel to man weather stations as early as 1886. Here, 1887, we want to complete a history as possible of the weather of the states of Nevada. And we're looking for employment. We have a director, W.H. Fallon, of the Weather Bureau, and he's looking to hire people. Here again, going to the weather conditions, and these were reported by John Fulton, a volunteer observer at Oregon State Weather Service. And there are always advertisements for the various forms of instrumentation. I'm going to pause here for a second if anybody wants to record these two websites. The NOAA Library and their library annual reports have great information about weather conditions, weather personnel, and descriptions of weather conditions that are really very fascinating to read. We see from the website on the left the various, some of the information that they have: hurricane reports, monthly weather review, report of the chief of the Weather Bureau. And I selected the U.S. Army Signal Weather Bureau annual reports for the year 1872. And you actually can download and view the entire document. This actually records the 1871 Chicago fire and how the fire spread. It's a fascinating read if you had anyone that lived in Chicago at that particular time. Weather Bureau topics and personnel for 1915. And we see changes under the remarks. We see the names of the people, what weather station they were working in. And we see, for example, Robert Moore. He's a messenger boy, and he resigned, but he had a good record. So think not necessarily your relative didn't have to be a meteorologist. He could have been an observer. Farmers out on the plains, their observations were key and critical. Mr. Heitzel at the bottom, he was appointed an assistant observer for $900. So services as student assistant terminated. So various aspects of the weather service. And we see the list of hurricanes, and they have information so you could choose and look at each one of those for particular years. And we see actual weather advisories that are issued. And we see the names of the people are Semblat for the Weather Bureau from San Juan and Mr. Gentry from Miami, who are predicting storms. The NOAA National Centers for Environmental Information also have additional weather information. They have a climate data model where you can enter your particular location and see the weather anywhere from 1893 up to current times. And the color coding on the bottom will show up when you, so we're getting the green. So in 1893, we see the actual precipitation here in Canyon City. July apparently was a good monsoon season that year. So while you might not think that you had anybody that was involved with the Weather Service, weather certainly was an important aspect of your ancestors' lives, just as it is for us today. We prepare for storms. We prepare for, in our particular case here in Canyon City, fires. Fires are critical because of lack of rain or precipitation. So think about the recording that might have been done. Didn't have to actually work for the Weather Service, but might have had some tangential way of being involved in the Weather Service. So I thank you for joining me this morning. And next month, we're going to talk about catalog and kit houses. Did somebody in your family live in one of these houses? Did they go through one of the catalogs, one of the many catalogs, and look to see to buy a house? We might even have one of those houses here in Canyon City. So I look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you very much and have a good day.